Hello and welcome to our webinar today on what you need to know about California's IoT Security Law. My name is Kristen Santos and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm the marketing specialist here at Sectigo. Our panelists today are going to be Jason Soroko, CTO of PKI, and Tim Callan, Senior Fellow both at Sectigo. And today we're estimating our webinar to be about 30 minutes with time for questions at the end. While you will remain on mute for the duration of the webinar, you can feel free to send in any questions through the chat, as you can see in the screenshot here. Now, without further ado, Tim, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Kristen. Thank you for the introduction. And Jay, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim.
It's always fun to talk to you. And today we are talking about a new law that is passed in California that's called Senate Bill 327, SB-327 for short. And this is commonly referred to as California's IoT Security Law. So a couple details for the folks, and then we can get into the color commentary. It's actually, the technical name of the law is Security for Connected Devices, or of Connected Devices. It was signed into law in 2018, and it did go into effect on January 1st rather of this year. And the basic point behind this law is to establish some minimum IT security baseline for devices that are sold or deployed in California. And I think it is pretty minimal. We'll get into that, but it's more than there is otherwise. So this law is pretty pioneering in that, for the most part, IoT devices from a security perspective are completely unregulated prior to this. Is that correct, Jay?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, I think that the Mirai botnet, which I think we're going to talk about here, Tim, was one of the big eye openers, especially down to consumer level IoT devices and other devices that were not specialist or industrial necessarily. And I think California, as a jurisdiction, just made the decision that vendors of IoT devices were not moving fast enough to even do the absolute minimal standards. And I think that this was a direct response to that Mirai botnet.
Absolutely. And a whole family of similar attacks and proofs of concept and things that came after that. So let's start with, what does the law actually say? So it's actually very short. The copy is very short. And it says that the manufacturer, you can read as well as I can, quote, shall equip the device with reasonable security feature or features. And then it goes on to emphasize that this stuff in a lot of ways is contextual, that what is reasonable security is going to depend on the nature and function of the device, what the information is that's being collected, but at a high level, that it's protecting information from unauthorized access, destruction, modification, or disclosure. I guess protecting information or processes, let's say, from unauthorized access, destruction, modification, or disclosure. And then it goes on to define a couple requirements for reasonable security features, one of which is that it cannot have pre-programmed passwords that are the same across all devices. So in the event that there are pre-programmed passwords, they must be unique to each device, and those passwords must be changeable by the user.
Yeah, Tim, a lot of devices, when they were being mass produced, had static username and password authentication mechanisms. And that was one of the reasons why the early versions of the Mirai botnet were able to harvest devices into the tens of thousands up to into the millions.
Yeah,
because
exactly. That's why Mirai was so successful. You get one password for one device of a type, and you just go out and you use it everywhere. And even if those passwords are changeable, they probably weren't changed. And in a lot of these devices, they couldn't be changed.
That's exactly right, Tim. And so therefore, I think the final bullet point on this slide might be the big one, which is there has to be some software-based mechanism to enable the user to be able, or the legitimate owner of the device to be able to actually change the authentication password. So, that's interesting in that that mechanism really did not exist in a lot of classes of devices.
Right.
It did in some, but in many devices it did not, and it's going to cause not just people who are selling devices into California, but probably right across the world, because you're not going to want to have different, a California SKU of your device.
Yeah.
I think California is pressing the issue that this is the absolute minimum that is acceptable, and I agree with it.
Yeah, and again, absolute minimum, right, for sure. And we'll get into some of the weaknesses with this, although it still is more than what there was previously. So that's progress. That's good. And yeah, your point being that surely this law will have impact beyond the state lines of California, right? For a few reasons that we're going to get into. So why did we need this, right? So you said the Mirai botnet. Quick reminder for everybody: Mirai in 2016, these giant DDoS attacks started happening, taking down systems that were widely considered to be undDDoSable. And as it all shook out, it turned out that there was this new monster botnet of a scale that no one had ever seen before, and that turned out to be Mirai.
Yeah, Tim, and I can tell you one interesting thing that happened is the early source code for the Mirai botnet itself became publicly available.
Yeah.
And just like we've seen with previous types of malware, once an idea becomes just out there, you no longer have to invent this kind of problem. Therefore, the variations of the Mirai botnet, of which it's been named many different things. There's now, you can consider there to be thousands of variations of this. The proliferation of this as an issue is a major problem.
Right. And yeah, and of course how these kinds of attacks always go is first you get somebody who's right on the spearhead, who's very innovative and educated and clever and is just on the cutting edge of things. Once they prove the concept, there is an order of magnitude larger or 2 orders of magnitude larger group of people who totally have the chops to do the same thing. They just didn't think of it. And then you start seeing that used by those groups, and those tend to be advanced persistent threats and major criminal organizations. And then after that, it moves into kind of script kiddie land where anybody with a basic understanding of computer science can follow the instructions. And at this point, we're in phase 3 for this kind of attack.
Yes, Tim, and I think it's worth noting that this attack has morphed far beyond just harvesting static username and passwords. There's all kinds of vulnerabilities now that are being exploited by this kind of thinking, and therefore that's what makes the California legislation probably, just the first step. And we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, so why was this needed to begin with? I mean, why did Mirai botnet happen? Well, the fundamental, I think there's a prisoner's dilemma style problem in IoT device security, which is that the primary party who is harmed is neither the party who is making the device nor the party who is purchasing it, right? So as the purchaser, maybe you're being harmed because your device might be running inefficiently and your bandwidth might be eaten up. But as long as your device is doing what it needs to do, you might not notice or care that somebody's using it to run DDoS or mine Bitcoin. And the reason that you're going to care ultimately is that other people are going to be harmed, right? The people who get these, get the phishing attacks that are being run or the DDoSes or et cetera, the botnet expansion techniques, all of that stuff is hurting someone else. And so under those circumstances, there aren't really economic motivators for the manufacturers to put this security in place because it doesn't hurt their sales. And it doesn't hurt their sales because the consumer doesn't care, and the consumer doesn't care because it doesn't directly hurt the consumer in a visible way. And so as a consequence, this is exactly where Only legislation will solve this problem.
I'm almost certain that the people who designed the closed circuit television that was part of the very early Mirai botnet issue never considered their closed circuit televisions that were going to be used to cause a denial of service against a major, a globally major DNS service, which is a fundamental infrastructure of the internet. I'm sure they never connected the two together.
Right. And if you think about, if you were, especially if you were early in the IoT device market, a few years ago, and you're trying to release these internet-enabled consumer devices, you're trying to get pre-made parts from Taiwan that are already proven that are working. You're trying to grab, components or chipsets that perfectly well have been in the market and are successful, and with a minimum of modification, get them into the right shaped piece of plastic, put a little firmware on it, and get it into the market. So nowhere in that process is somebody creating a spec for security needs that haven't been identified as a customer pain point.
Yeah, and
right?
when you're selling 10 million of something, every penny matters, right?
Absolutely, and every penny matters. So you want it cheap and out of the box, and you want the thing that they're doing the volume on. And so all of that discouraged this kind of innovation. So a California law came along. Now, this law, as we said, it's a good start. It is not perfect. So I just listed some of the potential weaknesses here. Maybe you want to walk us through these, Jay?
Yeah, absolutely. So therefore, there's nothing in the legislation that says that the the user themselves has to actually change the default password, only that it has to be unique out of the box. So that's something. It might not be the worst
But unique
part
might
of the
be
issue.
increment by one, right? Might be
Yeah,
password 00001, password 00002, password 00003. Guess what? That's unique, but it's still predictable.
that's right. And there's nothing in the legislation stopping that condition from happening. So we're going to have to watch for that. Additionally, of course, any sort of static username and password, or what we like to call in the business a symmetric token, which is any kind of secret that's shared at both the the device itself and with someone else. I mean, those passwords could be leaked en masse or socially engineered one by one, depending on what the target is. And I think the third bullet point on this slide, Tim, is the one I'm most worried about. Is the California legislation says nothing about protecting the device itself or protecting how the credential shows up on the network. So therefore, you could have authentication mechanisms where the credential is actually in the clear on the network, which means harvesting that credential would not be difficult at all.
So, and in fact, it could even be worse. I could have a password you don't know because it's a unique default. And when I change my password, I might be telling you my password and giving you access to it when previously you didn't have it.
Yes, there's nothing in the legislation stopping those conditions from happening.
And let me back up to bullet number 2 real quick, because I think this is very relevant, right? If you think this is hypothetical, let's think about all the articles we've been seeing about doorbells, right? In the last few weeks, in these Ring doorbells. And supposedly they say that was as a result of credential stuffing, right? So this is another way that this is done. Someone steals, someone does a breach and they get a bunch of usernames and passwords from some completely separate site. And we all know people reuse this information. So then they turn around and they start just hitting potential targets to see where they're going to get a hit on that same username password. They call that credential stuffing. And supposedly with the Ring devices, that's how it happened, right? That's what the manufacturer is saying. And so that's a real world example of what we just talked about, and some of the potential risks that still exist.
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing in the legislation about password policies, password strengths, guessability. I mean, yes, you can change the password, but you could change it to admin123.
Right.
Things that are easy to guess. And we get into the same old problem that we've been talking about, passwords that should be deprecated as an authentication mechanism anyway, because
Right.
human beings do quite a bad job at it. And when it comes to devices, they do a particularly bad job at it.
And that's a real good point, Jay. I mean, to some degree, maybe not the third bullet here, but to some degree, these problems that we're talking about now are not problems with IoT device passwords. They're just problems with passwords, right?
Yeah,
They're
in
fundamental
fact,
weaknesses of the password security mechanism.
it's a problem with any form of shared secret mechanism. Uh, even if these weren't passwords, even if they were embedded codes that were changing over time, if they're not encrypted, they can be intercepted in the clear. I mean, you could have quite sophisticated shared secret change mechanisms that would still be vulnerable to them.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, again, a fundamental, you're right. So not even a fundamental weakness of passwords, but a fundamental of any shared secret approach. So part of the solution, of course, for that is PKI. So PKI is stronger in a variety of ways. Again, you want to walk us down these?
Yeah, Tim, I think this is important to note because a device itself, which may itself be authenticating to other devices or the cloud, and of course, a human being who may, or even another device, which may be authenticating to another device, you really need to take out of the hands the credential itself. In other words, it's best to actually let the device possess a secret which
Yeah.
is never revealed and it's a very, very difficult to steal.
Yeah.
This is what has made PKI the basis of just about every single standards body who's considering security for IoT. What they all have in common is they've chosen PKI because of what you said here, Tim. It's consistent, it's reliable, it's
Right.
repeatable, and it's utterly ubiquitous, whether you know it or not.
Absolutely.
Most of the use cases that you do on a daily basis probably have some sort of PKI behind them.
There are few computing paradigms that have been as broadly used for as much time as PKI has and have held up.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And I would say, Tim, only recently with the advent of DevOps, which is a whole other technology that you and I have talked about, and with IoT, that human authentication mechanisms that were handled by PKI, I would say that traditional old school PKI might not have had that scalability to any size, but it does now. PKI, as of right now, does have that ability to scale.
Yeah.
And I think one of the other great things is things such as TPMs, secure elements, etc. In other words, where do you hide that credential? Where can you put that safe, asymmetric credential? The technologies and the price points for those technologies and the form factors for that has now made it so that IoT and PKI really should be synonymous in terms of baking in security in a way that's economical and extremely secure.
And that's a super important point, Jay. And one of the things you've said in our conversations in the past is this ain't your father's PKI, right? And I think that's a really good point that, if people who maybe got involved in PKI in the 90s, right, or the early 2000s, and sort of viewed this as kind of like, okay, here's your fundamental toolkit, go write a lot of code, right? QA it and make sure it works. We've come a long way since then. And there is now there are very well proven platforms and mechanisms that people can use to put these keys and certificates in place, manage them, have them work correctly, not have outages, have visibility, etc., in a way where you're not sitting there and you're not DIYing it.
So Tim, I on the last bullet point, I really think it's time for us to talk about another elephant that might be in the room, which is the fact that California, as you said, was the pioneer in passing this legislation. But many other jurisdictions have either passed or are really well on in the process of developing legislation that goes far further than that symmetric secret change
Yeah.
mechanism. And they actually do now call for things that are directly related to protecting the digital identity of the device and protecting the life cycle of that digital identity through some of the things you have in your final bullet point, which is
Right.
an embedded firewall, secure elements, secure boot. Those are things that are now part of guidance and part of legislations that have been proposed in other jurisdictions, such as the U.S. federal government, the UK, and others.
Right. So like one thing that I think most people don't know, which is really interesting, it's related to this, is that Microsoft requires, if you're going to license Windows 10 for any device, you are required to have a TPM in that device, or they won't license it to you. Right?
Yes.
And so that this is a trend, right? And legislation is one very important way that these things come in, but it's not the only way. And this is a movement that we're seeing throughout industry.
And I would say, Tim, one of the earliest pioneers in getting the price point for this as low as possible were the smartphone handset manufacturers. So
Absolutely.
Apple with their Enclave, various Android handset providers, they've been taking advantage of these technologies, including secure boot and various forms of secure elements now for several years, and it's been extremely successful.
Right. And that's where, again, we see, as we always see, so much of making these things work, making them interchangeable and economical and, small in size and small in power consumption and all that sort of thing is that scale, right? So having that scale in those devices and having the economic motivation to make them really work correctly in that sort of form factor opens doors for everybody else to take advantage of that knowledge. So let's get to our recommendations. So in light of this this law, there's a few things we can recommend. And first of all, so if you're a manufacturer of IoT devices, at minimum, you better be including unique passwords or shared secret to follow the legal requirements. So this is a legal requirement that you have if you're releasing devices in California, and you better do it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Tim. And it, as you look down this list, I think, as we said, the NIST back in July of 2019 put out their guidance of which the U.S. federal legislation is going to be based. And I would say that if you take a look around the world at UK legislation and even other state jurisdictional law, is pretty much lockstep with a lot of this guidance. So when we're saying recommendations, I think absolutely number one on this list is will make you compliant with California's legislation. But I think you really do need to start looking at numbers 2 to 4 as well in order to be compliant in the future and future-proof yourself.
Absolutely. So of course certificates. The good news is if you decide to use certificates, you don't have to worry. First of all, it's more secure, and second of all, you're going to be compliant with those other requirements. So you could just use certificates instead, and it takes a whole lot of the hassle and the headache out of things, and it reduces your vulnerabilities, like we said. And so much of this is about the device and the form factor and the needs and et cetera, but at least seriously consider how TPM and secure boot can enter into making your devices more secure. And again, keep an eye out for future legislation that for a device in your class and of your nature will require that, right? So even if you don't do it now, you may be stuck having a new roadmap item to get that done in the near future. And then the last point I think is really important because, you sort of think, well, and we alluded to this at the beginning, the California state lines are only so big. And yes, it's a big state, but it's just one state. But just, the facts of distribution and the channel are such that you may be making your life orders of magnitude harder when you try to differentiate between what's going into California and what isn't. What if you're wrong, right? So you have a California and a non-California SKU, and now you have to make sure they're correct and blah, 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 blah. So we're predicting that what a lot of people are going to do, and actually probably what for a lot of people you should do, is just do this for everything in the US or everything in North America, right? And don't try to force Ingram Micro and Tiger Direct to get the right SKU to the right place. Just give them something that they can sell anywhere.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Tim. In order to bring down costs, to bring up that scalability, this is, having multiple SKUs for different geographies just won't make any sense.
And once you've put your system in place to be able to give unique passwords anyway, usually the marginal cost of applying that to other units is nearly zero, right? Once you've done the upfront work. So it's probably easier just to change this as your sort of your fundamental baseline product. And then lastly, and we kind of touched on this, lots of people get in trouble when they try to home grow this stuff. And this is a thing that you and I talk about, in different ways. I've talked about a few times in our podcast and webinar series, but don't DIY your PKI. Like this has been done. This has been figured out. There are platforms that you can take off the shelf that will do this for you. And there's no reason to sit and try to cook this stuff from scratch.
And Tim, one way to work with an expert partner and to not have to reinvent a lot of wheels is to actually get involved in a standards body, not even as an active member that is inventing this stuff, but join just so that you can get a hold of the documentation that shows you exactly how to do it. These consortiums will typically have hack fests and a lot of support for you so that you can bring your devices to these conferences, actually get experts to talk about it, and get that thinking built into your devices. So that you're not reinventing the wheel, and you can actually have people actively helping you to embed the latest and greatest thinking into your device. I think getting involved in standards bodies makes sense. These consortiums, there's probably one for your vertical, regardless of what vertical you're in.
Right, and these bodies, I sit on a few of them, and I've sat on a few of them over the years. These bodies are always very interested in getting feedback from industry and feedback from real users, right? They tend to be a bunch of people who are very steeped in the details of how this kind of technology works, and they're very knowledgeable, but they love getting that real world acid test, right? They love to really have, to hear and understand what the people who are actually going to be implementing and living with these things are facing as pain points and processes, and it makes the standards better and stronger. So, there's usually a great deal of opportunity, even if you don't qualify, if you don't meet the qualifications to be a full member, there's almost always an opportunity for some kind of observer or observing member status. And again, most of these standards bodies are publishing their work in a very public way. They oftentimes have public boards or lists where anyone can come contribute. And by all means, you can do that.
I would say there are enormous benefits to doing it, Tim, because your ability to differentiate yourself from a competitor, your ability to get perhaps certified and standardized, being able to put a standards body name on a tin, even things like Underwriters Laboratory might be in your future in terms of being able to say this is a cyber secure device, might help you to differentiate yourself, or it might even be required by law at some point, depending on what vertical you're in.
And knowing what's coming.
Yeah, and further to that, you might want your IoT device as a vendor to be able to work within a standards body ecosystem. And that's an enormous benefit, because there's getting to be fewer and fewer IoT devices that are completely standalone. Most of them will connect to something, and that something might not be, it might even be a competitor of yours that you might want your device to be able to connect to as part of a much larger ecosystem to increase your revenue dollars. So this is an interesting nexus point, Tim, where good security can actually lead to bigger revenue potential as well.
I completely agree. So if you've liked this conversation, Jason and I run a regular podcast called Root Causes, a PKI and Security podcast. You can find it basically in all the popular places where you stream podcasts. We talk about all kinds of things in the world of PKI and digital certificates and, digital and device identity. And we go deep on a lot of different topics, and we would love to have you join us and listen. And we have a big backlog of podcasts you can listen to as well. So please come join us. And with that, I think we are ready for questions. Kristen, have we gotten any questions?
Yes, we got a few actually.
Okay, cool.
So I'll kick it off with the first one. So if you're direct selling devices to large customers for deployment in specific places, couldn't you tell the difference between which devices were being deployed in California and then those that aren't, just make two kinds of devices?
Well, okay, yeah, I would say maybe. I mean, a lot of this depends on the details of you and your business, right? So, like, let's say I'm going to make this up. Let's say that my customer is utilities, right? I might say I have a water company in Pennsylvania, and I know perfectly well that it's a water company in Pennsylvania, and that's where my devices are going to be. Okay, so maybe you don't need to worry about this, right? If that's you and that's the sum total of your market, or you have a product that's only sold there, maybe for that one you don't need to worry about this for now, right? Until more legislation comes in, as Jason points out. But for most IoT device manufacturers, it's probably not that clean, right? For most IoT device manufacturers, you probably don't have an exact control over when something rolls off the assembly line, where is it ultimately going to wind up in use? And, again, if it's anything that consumers use, or even if not, if it's a component kind of thing that could be purchased and used in a variety of different environments, or if you've got a channel that ultimately you've got system integrators that are out there doing the work, how do you know for sure where this stuff is going to wind up?
Tim, what's interesting is we could have retitled this whole thing legislation and guidance and how it affects you, period.
Right.
The California legislation, in order to answer that question, that's absolutely the topic of this particular webinar. But to even your example, Tim, of the water plant in Pennsylvania, that water plant in Pennsylvania is probably coming under some sort of critical infrastructure notation that needs to comply with NIST cybersecurity framework.
Right.
And therefore, a lot of the things that we talked about here, you do come under that, regardless of the California legislation. So I guess the way to answer that question
is yes, it's theoretically possible, but probably not usually in practice. Right, Jay?
Yeah. The thing is, though, is that I think in the near future, the big takeaway is that California was absolutely pioneering, but there's almost not a single use case in IoT that isn't going to come under something in the near future. I mean, the connected teddy bear, perhaps not, but even though it probably should.
Right. Yeah, actually, it probably should, for a variety of reasons. Yeah, I use that example in one of our podcasts. We actually have one of those. It's really cool. It's it's a program for my son. I go to a website and I say what I want it to say, and then it knows what to say, which is great. So it says his favorite food is bananas, and now it knows that. So that's really neat. But that device could be turned into part of a botnet, right? And so it probably still does fall and needs to fall into this legislation. What's next?
Right, and I think that tees up this next question perfectly.
Okay.
So do you think that other states will follow suit and pass their own IoT security laws?
Other states have.
We touched on this. Yeah, that question probably came in early in the webinar before we got that far. And you've seen this in other areas, right? So California tends to be a leader in this kind of technology stuff. And a lot of states are going to pay attention to what California does because they consider California to be very good at this. And we've already seen that happen, right? The other legislation will be coming into, it's not in effect yet, right? But there will be other legislation coming, going into effect in the next year or two. And I think there's more, right? If you think about the California breach law, which came, I'm going to say in 2007, that's a bit of a guess, was revolutionary at the time. If your personally identifiable information was stolen, the company had things that it had to do. It had to let you know. It had to offer you some kind of remedy. And nobody had legislation like that at the time. It was a radical thing. It only affected companies in California. Well, now everybody's got a breach law, right? Most of the states, most of the countries in the Western world have breach laws in place. And how did it all start? It all started from that starting point, which was the state of California. So, we see this a lot, and I think we'll see it here too.
Yeah, and to be very specifically to answer it, it was actually Oregon. That legislation is, I think, pending, but I think it's going to go through, and
Yeah.
U.S. federal is likely
Looking
to
at it.
pass as well. So it's coming.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to see this in the major European nations because they're big on privacy, and they'll be right behind this as well.
UK and Australia both.
Yep.
Very recently. Yep.
Oh yeah, Australia had something that just went into effect on the 1st of the year also.
Australia's is actually one of the most stringent I've seen defined, so it's interesting.
That's right. That's a good point, Jay. What else do we have, Kristen?
So despite these other governing bodies going to be following suit, is it possible that as a result of this law, some manufacturers will just stop offering their devices in California?
Well, I suppose if it's not economically feasible for you to make the roadmap changes to your device, for you to put the R&D in and change your supply chain and source things in a way where you can manufacture to be compliant with these laws, I guess you're going to go out of business. But then someone else will come fill that niche, and they'll have a product that does the same thing and is compliant. So, the consumer won't really be hurt much by this. And if an individual company isn't able to comply, then that company probably wasn't ready for the IoT mainstream anyway.
I think, Tim, another way to think about this as well is the supply chain of these IoT devices is actually quite complex, but in a good way, in
Right.
that ultimately the chipsets are not usually made by the final OEM manufacturer. And the chipsets themselves, you're increasingly seeing PKI capability and secure elements built right into the chipsets at an economical price.
Right. And if they're not doing it, this is going to be their motivator to do it. So if I'm sitting there and I'm a fundamental chip manufacturer, I'm in Taiwan, all right, I'm outside of California's jurisdiction. I don't care, right? Well, I do care because my customers who are going to buy from me need to have this capability, and this goes into their spec, right? And this becomes part of the request for quote that I receive. And so I've got to be able to offer this capability in order to stay competitive in my market. And so a law like this forces that capability all the way up the supply chain. And then once that's in the supply chain, guess what? It's available to everybody. It becomes much more straightforward for anybody to say, I want this capability, because it's now, a pick and pull kind of capability that they can get in the devices that they're in the components that they're buying.
Yeah, there's no excuse anymore. This is off the shelf. It's plug and play. And absolutely, I think your point number 5 on one of the previous slides, Tim, which was to work with a partner. There are people out there who know this stuff cold, and so therefore they can bring that smarts into what you need.
Yep. Do you have any more questions?
Let's see, one more. And
Okay.
I know you guys mentioned earlier the Mirai botnet. It happened so many years ago. Why has it taken so long to get this law?
Yeah. Mirai was 2016. It's now 2020. But if you think about it, the legislation passed in 2018. They just needed to give industry a chance to catch up. So what you really want to look at is there's about a 2-year gap between when the Mirai botnet happened and when the legislation passed. And I don't know, I'm not a legislator, but that, that strikes me as maybe credible for how long it takes this sort of thing to happen.
Yeah, I don't think governments are in the business of trying to put people out of business or to put, undue pressure on industry. They did need to give them time, and they did give them plenty of time.
Yeah.
That is why it took so long. And even the legislation itself, when it first came out, there were a lot of security experts, not the least of which was Tim and I, pointing out the limitations. And so even the legislation itself, what really was only forcing the IoT device manufacturers to do the absolute bare minimum, and that itself took a long time. So, here's another way of thinking about it, I think, Tim, which is the fact that government had to get involved at all was a
Right.
sign that things were moving too slowly on the IoT device vendor side. I
Yeah.
think if IoT device vendors were to have been uptaking the available technologies in a way that perhaps didn't stop the Mirai botnet, but was at least mitigating it, perhaps we wouldn't be hearing about all these different government jurisdictions jumping in to have to write this legislation. They're jumping in because of the slow speed,
Yeah.
not of the legislators, but of the IoT device vendors.
And I think you're right. The technology legislation has had a checkered past. And I think responsible legislators try to get feedback from technologists, manufacturers, and the community of potential users before they go and pass laws that are not going to work very well. And that does take, it just forces time onto the calendar, no way around it. So if it takes a couple years to get to the point where you've got a bill you can pass, and then you need to give people another 18 months to prep for it, all of a sudden you're at your 3.5 years that you're looking at here. So that's how. Anything
Awesome.
else?
Thank you guys. That's it for our questions today.
All right. Well, thanks everybody so much for joining us. And I'm going to shamelessly plug our podcast one more time. Root Causes. Come search for us and listen to us talk about PKI.
Thank you, Tim.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Tim. And everyone, be on the lookout. Tomorrow you'll receive the recording of today's webinar as well as our webinar last Thursday on CCPA. Thanks, everyone.